In 1961, a man sat in a small room at Yale University, staring at a machine with 30 switches. Each switch delivered an electric shock. The first was labeled 15 volts. The last was labeled 450, and under it, 3 letters. X. In the next room, strapped to a chair, was a man he had met 20 minutes earlier, a pleasant, slightly overweight accountant in his 40s. That man was screaming, and the man at the machine kept flipping switches. He was not a sadist. He was not a criminal. He was a school teacher or a clerk or an engineer, answering a newspaper ad for $4. The question that haunted the next 60 years of psychology is simple. Why did he keep going? The experiment belonged to a young psychologist named Stanley Milgram. Milgram was Jewish, born in New York, and he had grown up hearing what happened to families like his in Europe. In April of 1961, a former Nazi official named Adolf Eichmann stood trial in Jerusalem. Eichmann had helped organize the deportation of millions of people to their deaths, and in court he did not look like a monster. He looked like a middle manager. His defense, repeated over and over, was that he had been following orders. Most people found that explanation obscene. Milgram found it interesting. He wanted to know whether ordinary Americans, people with no ideology, no grudge, no war, would inflict serious harm on a stranger simply because a man in a lab coat told them to. 4 months after the trial began, he started finding out. The advertisement in the New Haven newspaper promised $4.50 car fare for 1 hour of participation in a study of memory and learning. When a volunteer arrived, he met 2 people. One was the experimenter in a gray technician's coat. The other was a friendly stranger who had supposedly answered the same ad. They drew slips of paper to decide roles. Teacher and learner. The draw was rigged. The volunteer was always the teacher. The friendly stranger was always the learner, because he was not a volunteer at all. He was an actor. The learner was taken to an adjoining room, strapped into a chair, and wired to an electrode. Paste was applied to his skin, the experimenter explained, to avoid blisters and burns. The learner mentioned casually that he had a mild heart condition. The teacher was seated in front of the shock generator and given a real, genuine 45-volt shock, so he would understand exactly what he was about to administer. The task was simple. The teacher read out word pairs. The learner had to remember them. Every wrong answer earned a shock, and every shock was 15 volts stronger than the last. At 75 volts, the learner grunted. At 120, he shouted that the shocks were becoming painful. At 150, he demanded to be released. He said his heart was bothering him. He said he refused to go on. At 270, he screamed in agony. At 300, he pounded on the wall. And after 330 volts, there was nothing at all. No answers, no sounds, silence, which, under the rules of the experiment, counted as a wrong answer. Almost every teacher turned around at some point and asked to stop, and each time the experimenter responded with one of 4 scripted lines, delivered calmly, in order. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. The experimenter never threatened. He never raised his voice. He offered no punishment and no reward. He simply refused to release anyone from the task. Before running the study, Milgram asked people to predict the outcome. Senior psychology students at Yale guessed that perhaps 1 to 3% of participants would go all the way to 450 volts. A panel of psychiatrists estimated closer to 1 in 1,000. And they assumed that person would be clinically disturbed. In the first version of the experiment, 40 men took part. Every single one continued past 300 volts. 26 of the 40, 65%, went to the final switch, past the screaming, past the silence, to the one labeled X. And they were not calm about it. Milgram's notes describe men sweating, trembling, biting their lips, digging fingernails into their palms. Some laughed uncontrollably from stress. They were in visible distress the entire time. They just didn't stop. But the famous 65% is not really the finding. Milgram ran more than 20 variations of this experiment, and the variations are where it becomes genuinely unsettling. because obedience turned out to be extraordinarily sensitive to small changes in the situation. Move the experiment out of Yale and into a rundown office building in Bridgeport, and full obedience dropped to roughly 48%. Put the learner in the same room so the teacher could see him, and it fell to about 40%. Force the teacher to physically press the learner's hand onto the shock plate, and it fell to 30. Have the experimenter give his orders by telephone from another room, and it collapsed to around 21%. And some participants lied, pretending to deliver shocks they never gave, and in the most hopeful variation of all. Put two other teachers in the room and have them refuse. When ordinary people watched ordinary people rebel, obedience fell to roughly 10%. The lesson was never that most humans are monsters. It was that most humans are exquisitely responsive to the architecture of the room they are standing in. The study is also one of the most criticized in the history of psychology. Participants were deceived and put under severe distress, and the outrage helped build the modern system of ethics review boards that would never approve this experiment today. Later researchers who went into Milgram's own archives found that the reality was messier than the published version. Experimenters sometimes improvised pressure far beyond those 4 scripted lines, and a meaningful share of participants suspected the shocks weren't real. The clean 65% is not as clean as the textbooks suggest, but partial replications, under modern ethical limits, have still found obedience rates disturbingly close to Milgram's. In different countries, in different decades, which leaves us with the question he was actually asking, not, would you press the button? Everyone believes they wouldn't. The question is, who is standing in the room with you? And are they saying anything at all?